The drive out took a few hours. As I pulled off the main highway and onto the branching road, I was struck with a sense that I was going to be very alone out here. I'm an avid hiker, but since many of the hiking trails I normally frequent had become almost crowded as of late, for this trip I'd settled on a trail that I'd vaguely heard of but knew next to nothing about. It led up towards some serious wild territory, with nothing around for hundreds of miles. The land was technically a part of the nearby national parks, but was only barely mentioned on the park's website. I suspected that this was because it was much further out than the regularly visited trails, only accessible from a branching road that pretty much led to nowhere. My plan was to head into the wilderness and camp out overnight under the stars. I live in a desert state, no, I won't tell you which one, and I figured that there'd be some stunning views of the constellations in the cloudless sky at night, especially since it was forecasted to be a moonless night. I'd already walked the popular day trails in the area, so I was looking into something a bit more farther afield. The plan was to camp out under the stars and head back in the morning. The deserted road suggested that I was in the right thinking that nobody came out this far. It should be a good chance to relax and get away from it all. Eventually, I reached my destination and pulled off the asphalt road and into the gravel of the parking area, tires crunching as I slowed to a stop off to one side of the road. Now, a parking lot would have been a bit too generous a title. It was really just an unsealed area next to the highway with a signpost announcing the entrance to the national park territory. The area was almost empty. Only a single other car was parked up. I got out and stretched, looking around and spotting the low sign that marked the trailhead. As I did, I took a second to glance over at the other parked car. It looked like it had been there for an age. All 4 tires were flat, although they didn't look to be punctured. Every surface was dusty. I looked back at my car, which was slightly coated from the drive-in, but this was well and truly caked on. There were no broken windows, and it didn't look like it had been stolen and dumped. It didn't look damaged at all. Must have been here for a while, I thought to myself, wondering why no one from the park service had towed it away by now. I made a mental note to call them about it when I got back home. I opened the door to my back seat and I got out my backpack, a hat, and a rifle. I thought long and hard about whether or not to bring the rifle. I mean, it was extra weight after all, and odds were I wouldn't even need it. But last time I'd been out hiking overnight, I had a far too close encounter with a coyote that left me wishing that I had something more than just rocks to protect myself with. I figured since that it was only a small .22 caliber, it wouldn't be too heavy, and I packed it into a light soft case so that it fit alongside my pack. I reached into my pack for my sunscreen and slathered some onto my arms and neck before turning off my phone. I already called my sister before I left town to let her know my plans, and I stowed it away with my keys. Shouldering my things, I set it off to the trail. I'd gone no more than a couple hundred yards when I slowed to a stop, nose in the air. There was a slight breeze, but with it came the hint of something behind it. I winced as the warm air hit my face because the smell it wafted towards me was terrible. Jeez, it smells like something died, I muttered to myself. The breeze died down and the smell went with it. Ugh, I said before setting off again and picking up the pace. I couldn't see any buzzards around, but if there was anything dead nearby, I didn't want to be anywhere near it if the wind kicked up again. The hike was uneventful. I won't bore you with all the details, but it was a great terrain. A clear and easy trail through the desert shrublands. Some hours in, and I was breathing as hard as I could as I reached the slightly hillier bit of the trail. I came to the top of the rise and saw that the terrain flattened out ahead in a wide plateau. Looking at the sun, I saw that it was the middle of the afternoon, and decided that this was as good a place as any to set up camp for the night. I walked another few minutes before stepping off the trail, spotting a nice, flat bit of land where the brush had cleared away. There were remnants of a campfire in the center, just a few bits of charcoal and some scorched ground. I nodded to myself, taking off my pack and rifle case and placing them on the ground near the old campfire. I spent over an hour bringing in firewood and another half hour breaking it all up into manageable pieces. There was plenty around, lots of low, dead bushes and shrubs all around the place. I wanted enough wood for the fire to last easily throughout the night. The sun was just starting to go down and it was beginning to get a bit chilly. I stood back and I looked at my woodpile. It was quite impressive, and probably way more than I'd actually need. Well, better safe than sorry, I shrugged to myself. The last rays of daylight were peeking over the horizon as I lit the fire, building it up until it was crackling away merrily. I ate a couple of power bars that I'd packed as a cold dinner, swigged down some water, and I sat on the ground looking up at the stars coming out, feeling very peaceful. But that feeling didn't last very long. I heard the wind pick up before I felt it. It whistled between the rocks and shrubs, seeming to whirl around, passing me and then doubling back before arriving. It brought a warmth with it that was odd for the desert at night. That wasn't the only thing that it brought with it, though. I sniffed as the breeze kicked up the flames in my little campfire and screwed up my face. The stench that I smelt earlier came with it, hot and rotten, like roadkill baking under the sun. I gagged and tried to hold my dinner down. The campfire flared up as the wind hit it, throwing sparks into the air. I watched as they floated into the sky, bright orange spots against the black, almost blending in with the stars. As they burned themselves out on the wind as it died down, the flames that it had kicked up lessening as well. The stench had died back a bit as well, but it was still there in the background, not being blown in my face anymore, though. Once the light from the flare had dimmed, everything seemed a lot darker. I looked around and shivered involuntarily, realizing just how dark it suddenly was. I looked up at the sky and wished that I hadn't chosen a moonless night for my hike. I looked back towards the fire and stopped dead. Something was wrong. I blinked hard and looked up at the sky again. The stars. The stars were gone. 1 second they'd been there, and the next they were just... well, they weren't anymore. As if the wind had blown them out like they were candles. There was nothing overhead, just a sudden blackness all around, seeming to press in against the dome of the light that my little campfire was throwing out. Oh, what the hell? I exclaimed as I was looking about me. The air hadn't changed temperature. It was still cool, but not cold. But an icy sense of unease was settling over me. I shivered again and tossed a couple of branches on the fire, and then I drew my jacket closed around me and zipped it up. Where before I had been able to faintly see the outline of the scattered shrubs and boulders by the faint starlight, now I couldn't see a thing. There was no horizon anymore. The suddenly black sky blended in completely with the mountains in the distance. I couldn't see anything in the darkness that was pressing in around me. I grabbed my pack and pulled out my phone, turning it on and quickly navigating to the flashlight app. The phone's flashlight lit up and cast a harsh light onto the ground, and then flickered and died. The phone was turning itself off again. I pressed the power button again, but the screen stayed stubbornly black. Shit, I thought to myself. Reaching back into my pack for my keys, I found the pin light on my key ring and turned that on, which also immediately flickered and turned off. I whacked it a couple of times to no avail, before giving up in disgust and stowing my keys and my phone back in my pack. I looked around me, shivering with unease again. It was very dark. I couldn't see more than 20 feet on either side of the fire. It was almost as if the light was being forced back onto itself. I couldn't hear anything other than the crackle of the campfire. The whistling of the wind had stopped, and that god-awful smell was still in the background, though. Like there was something dead nearby, and... what the hell was that? I heard a noise, like something clearing their throat. A thick, wet... My stomach dropped, my breath catching in my throat for a second. I wasn't alone out here. Looking in the direction that the noise had come from, I saw a small flash in the darkness, and then another. A tingle ran up my back of my neck as I realized that there was something out there, sitting just outside the reach of the light of the campfire, and it was watching me. My sister has a little dog, and I remember staying with her once and it looking at me from a dark room down the hall while I was in the brightly lit lounge. I couldn't see it at all, but I knew that it was there from the way that the light bounced off its eyes. Dim, yellowy pinpricks in the darkness, about a foot off the ground. What I saw was kind of like that, only instead of the eyes in the dark being knee-height like my sister's dog, they were 6 feet off the ground. Too tall to be a coyote or even a mountain lion. I thought to myself, almost absently, trying to control the fear that was bubbling up inside of me. "Yeah! Get out of here!" I yelled, standing and waving my arms in the air. But it didn't leave. Instead, the eyes came down a couple of feet, like the thing had lowered its head. I slowly moved to put the campfire between me and it moved in turn. I kept moving around the campfire, and it kept moving too. I stopped and stared at it, and it stopped and stared right back. Something else was strange too. My feet had crunched on the gravel as I turned to face it, as it circled, but it didn't make any sound at all as it moved. The darkness hid all but the barest outline, and even that was fuzzy at best. Apart from what I assumed were eyes, all I could see was a slightly darker spot in the blackness. Crouching, I picked up a rock and I chucked it at the general direction of the eye flashes. The rock sailed through the air, and I lost sight of it in the darkness. But I'd swear my aim was dead on. But it didn't hit anything. I just heard a crunch as the rock fell on the gravel and tumbled away. The flashes in the darkness bobbed up and down slightly. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me, and it seemed to be moving closer. Slowly, very slowly, I reached for my rifle case. Unzipping it and taking out my little .22. I pulled the bolt up and back, and then forward and down again, chambering around. As I did, the thing moved again. The eyes were coming back and slightly lower, as if it was coiling back on itself, like a cat getting ready to pounce. I moved my thumb to disengage the safety, pulling the stock tightly into my shoulder and aiming for where I guessed that the thing's center mass would be. A bit more than a foot below where the glint of the eyes were. "Don't make me use this!" I yelled at it again. "Just go away!" I heard a wet sound, like a growl from a dog crunching on food in its mouth, and I squeezed the trigger. The sound from my little firearm seemed deafeningly loud, splitting the quiet of the night like lightning splits the sky. I lowered it slightly, peering over the barrel towards the thing. It hadn't moved at all after coiling back. It stayed right there, ready to pounce. But there was no way that I had missed it. Not at this range. Work the bolt back, I frantically thought to myself. Get another round in, re-aim, and squeeze the trigger. Work the bolt, aim, squeeze the trigger. Again. Again! Again! The hammer came down on an empty chamber. My ammunition was spent. I'd only packed the single 5-round magazine. I hadn't thought that I'd need any more than that. The thing shifted slightly, growling again as it moved. The flash from its eyes in the firelight disappeared, and I lost sight of its outline. I lowered my rifle with shaking hands, switching my grip to clutch the still warm barrel like a club, readying to swing the stock into whatever that thing was. Something solid hit me in the back, and I screamed as I spun around on the spot, swinging the rifle like a bat. It whooshed through the air, hitting nothing. I took a step back, breathing hard as I saw that familiar glint in the dark, just beyond the border from where the light from the fire showed. It had gotten behind me in seconds, and I hadn't heard it move at all. But would it hit me if it hadn't come into the light? I looked down, and lying at my feet was a single hiking boot. I glanced back up towards that thing. It hadn't moved, it was just there, watching me. I looked back at the boot, which wasn't in the best shape. The fabric was torn, and it was caked in this reddish, brownish mud. Hang on, I thought, stooping to pick it up. I shifted it closer to the fire for a closer look. Blood. The boot was caked in dried blood. My head swam, and a fire tore through my nerves, the back of my neck prickling madly, and my skin was turning to goose flesh. I found myself on one knee, breathing heavily as I mumbled, "Oh shit, oh shit." I looked back towards the thing, which was still not moving, and I stood and I screamed at it. "What do you want with me?" But it didn't answer. I dropped the boot. I jumped as there was a small pop from one of the branches in the fire, but was suddenly struck with an idea. I moved closer to the fire and spotted a branch that only had one end alight. I pulled it from the blaze and I turned to face the thing. It growled again, and I held up the branch, which rose to more of a snarl as I threw it towards it. The blazing stick lit up the night as it tumbled through the air towards the thing, and a horrified thrill ran up my spine as I caught a better glimpse of the outline of it, just for a second before it scuttled away from the light. It was huge, big as a bear but without any of the mass, lean as opposed to bulky. It was dark, so dark that it seemed to flow and blend into the gloom behind it. It had 4 long legs attached to an almost stumpy torso, but it hadn't used all 4 when it moved. It used the front ones, like arms, to push itself upright onto its back legs and then danced madly away with those while its whole body and arms jerked from side to side. God, it was so tall. Maybe 8 feet high when moving on its back legs, and it never seemed to get fully upright. The thing that glinted in the firelight did seem to be its eyes, and the split-second glimpse from its face I caught was enough to make me take a step back in horror, because it almost looked human, but deathly wrong. Like if you took a person's face and stretched it forward so long that it looked like a horse's head. The mouth, though, it wasn't small like a horse's. It stretched all the way back to where the face met the rest of the skull. And then its mouth was stuffed full of far too many rotten-looking teeth, stained red in places. I think my legs gave way then. I found myself sitting on the ground, hugging my knees and rocking back and forth. What in the hell was that thing? And what did it want with me? The bloodstained boot didn't exactly fill me with hope that it was friendly. I used a shaking hand to grab some more sticks out of my woodpile and feed the campfire. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't come to the light, and it had moved away when the fire came near it. I gave a silent thanks to whatever urge had made me drag in as much wood as I had. The eyes had stopped moving again, and it seemed that the thing was content for the time being, just sitting in the darkness and staring at me. I stared right back, trying to think of what the hell I was even gonna do. And we stayed like that for a while, just looking at each other. Somewhere not too far away, a coyote howled. The eyes turned and bobbed up and down slightly in the direction of the howl. Was it sniffing the air? It turned back and faced me, and it grunted? Whatever the noise was, it sounded dissatisfied somehow. The thing turned away again, and I saw the barest smudge of an outline moving off into the darkness towards the howls. Within seconds, it was gone from sight, and as it faded from sight, so did its stench. I sat there, frozen for a moment, and then burst upwards, boots scrambling for grip on the loose gravel as I came to my feet. I frantically grabbed out my pack and swung it over my shoulder. I stooped up and picked up my rifle and swung that by its strap onto the other shoulder, and then hesitated, torn by indecision. Dare I risk it? I clenched my jaw and tried to swallow down the rising sense of fear. I picked up one foot and took a single step away from the fire, wincing as the gravel crunched underneath my foot, which seemed deafeningly loud in the silence that was broken only otherwise by the fire. I peered around, muscles tensing with anticipation, but I saw no sign of the thing. I took another step. The gravel crunched again. There was still no sign of it. I relaxed ever so slightly and took a deep breath and started briskly walking towards the trail. Once I hit it, I could turn right, and I was confident enough that I could follow it back to the parking lot, even in the dark. I'd taken no more than half a dozen hurried steps when I stopped dead, frozen in place. I could smell it again. The reek bringing the bile up in my throat. Heart racing, I turned my head slightly to the left, and I saw the glint in the dark. The light from the fire had dimmed as I'd moved away from it, but I was still just close enough for me to see the familiar reflection in the flames of its eyes again. A rumble came out of the darkness. A growl. I slid my front foot backwards, moving slowly back towards the fire, never once taking my eyes off where it seemed to be in the dark. I reached the far side and slid my pack and rifle off my shoulders, laying them down on the ground and sitting down next to them. As I did, I heard the coyote growl again. The thing seemed to grunt, and then it faded into the darkness as it turned away from me. What the hell was I going to do? It was like the thing was playing with me, but I wasn't going to risk making a run for it again. No way did I want it to catch me in the dark. The darkness seemed to kill my phone and my flashlight when it settled in, and any flaming torch from the fire that I took would burn out well before I made it back to my car. I still had my lighter, but there was no way that was going to make a difference to keep it away. The coyote began to howl once more, but the howl was cut off quickly, turning into a snarl. I listened closely as the snarls became pained and then desperate yelps, and I held my breath as they were cut off, replaced by the sound of something snapping, crunching, and splattering. I breathed deeply, listening as I tried to slow my hammered heartbeat down. Nothing. Once again, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. I shut my eyes, listening harder, and shrieked as something hit the ground next to me, scrambling backwards on my butt away from it, waiting for it to leap up at me and grab me. I had gotten a few yards away when I stopped scrambling and just sat there, hyperventilating, staring at the ruined pile of gray fur and red gore that laid on the ground in front of me. It was the coyote, or what was left of the coyote. It was a mess. It looked like every bone in its body had been pulverized, and its front legs were completely missing, but raggedly missing, like they'd been torn away rather than cleanly cut or bitten off. Worst of all was its head was facing the wrong way. It was twisted around until it was entirely backwards. Blood seeped from its open mouth, collecting into drops that hit the dusty gravel with a soft splat. I shuddered, and hugging my knees tight, rocking back and forth slightly. This must have been the coyote that I'd heard howl earlier. This was the one thing that it went after. Oh, shit. I stood. Where was it now? I circled on the spot, looking out into the dark. There. On the other side of the fire, just beyond the border where the light ended, that familiar, reflective double flash. It was still watching me. Fuck you! I screamed at it. I strode at the dead coyote, grabbed it by its still warm tail, and swung it around, casting it away from the fire towards that thing. It flumped to the ground, not too far away from where the light ended, but the thing didn't move. I fought to get my breathing under control, kicking dust over the small patch of blood that had pooled to where the coyote lay. I looked at my hands, and they were sticky with blood too. I grabbed my water and rinsed the worst of it off, wiping my hands on my pants to dry them. And then I heard a grunt, and I turned to see one long, impossibly thin limb reaching in from the shadows to grab the dead coyote by the tail, slowly dragging it out of the light. It was hard to see any detail. It was almost as if it was radiating the darkness out from itself, but I could see that it seemed to end at a hand that again looked pretty human, but wrong? The fingers were way too long, and they were jointed in too many places. It looked like someone reaching out with a collection of tarantula legs on the end of a stick. It made a pained sort of sound while it was doing it. I guess the light was hurting it. The coyote disappeared from view, leaving bloody drag marks in the dust. And I heard a horrific ripping and squelching sounds. I guess that the thing was tearing it apart and eating it. The eating noises eventually stopped, and then the thing grunted. It sounded unsatisfied, though, and it went back to staring at me. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me, not just the coyote. I picked up some more branches and built up the fire, and then sat down and stared at the reflective eyes in the dark. I don't know how long I sat like that for. It must have been hours. I built up the fire a couple more times and went back to staring at the thing. It grunt or growl every now and again, but then it shut up. For the time being, it seemed satisfied to just sit and stare. Eventually, I found my blinks getting longer. Each time it was harder to open my eyes again. God, I was so tired. The adrenaline spike had long since worn off and I felt wiped out. Just a second. I'll close my eyes for a second, I thought to myself as my head began to nod forward. I jerked bolt upright and wide awake at the thrill that ran up my spine as I heard a wet and throaty from behind me. I'd fallen asleep. The fire had burned down low and was mostly just embers, only emitting a faint glow just enough for me to see that the thing had crept much closer as the light had diminished. I must have dozed off for an hour or more. Leaping to my feet, I grabbed some branches from the pile and hurled them onto the remnants, and then fell to my hands and knees so I could frantically blow into the embers, desperately trying to stir them back to life. The light flared up as they caught alight, and I saw it sitting there, way too close, squatting on its hind haunches like a dog sitting, long legs folded up so that what I assumed were its knees were up to the shape of its head, and its arms were extended down on the ground in front of it, holding its torso upright. The light glinted from its eyes as it shifted its head to stare at me again, and it hissed as it pushed itself backwards, retreating from the light. As I lost sight of it in the darkness, I heard that wet sound again. It's like a long tongue smacking against lips. I shuddered. I got a better look at its eyes in the light this time. They were filled with pure hunger and pain. But there was an intelligence there. Human eyes, not entirely those of an animal. It went back to looking at me, only this time it wasn't silent. It kept growling and grunting, and the noises that it was making grew in volume and frequency. It almost sounded desperate. It circled the fire, eyes disappearing from view and then reappearing elsewhere where I'd growl from the dark, but it never came into the firelight. I didn't say anything, just kept feeding the fire and hoped that my stock of firewood would hold out just a little while longer. I brought a lot in, but it was diminishing by this point. Then, finally, the thing made a noise that I hadn't heard yet, a hiss higher in pitch than anything else that it had made, and it looked up at the sky before staring at me once more. It made a disgusted sort of noise and then turned away. I heard the wind kick up and I could smell the thing's stench again. And then all of a sudden it was just gone. As the thing went, the smell and the suffocating darkness went with it, and I realized that I could clearly see around me again. The sky had that deep, dark blue color you see before the sunrise, and I could see a few pinpricks of light that could have only been stars. It got progressively lighter and lighter until there. The sun peeked up over the horizon, and I had never been as happy to see the light of day as I was now. I waited another hour and a half until the sun was well into the sky and things were starting to heat up before I dared to even make a move. I picked up my things and I got the hell out of there, shuddering as I passed the remnants of the coyote, just a bloody patch of gray fur and shattered bones. I jogged the whole time, never pausing, never stopping, and never looking behind me. Every time I slowed, I'd hear the wind whistle again and I'd catch a faint whiff of something foul, so I picked up the pace again. Hours later, I was just about ready to drop again when there was the start of the trail. I could see down the car park. Without stopping my jog, I reached back and pulled my backpack off, holding it in one hand and awkwardly cradling the gun case in my other arm as I scrambled in my pack for my car keys. I almost tripped as the hard trail gave way to the gravel of the car park, but I managed to keep my footing as I scrambled towards the car. I fumbled with the keys for what seemed like an age before throwing open the door, tossing my things across and slinging myself into the driver's seat, both hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckle grip. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and was taken aback by how haggard and wild-eyed the figure that stared back at me was. There were rivers of clear skin and the dust caking my face, and I realized that I'd been sobbing with relief since I'd been able to see the end of the trail. I looked back at where the trail had started and saw that the dust from the past was swirled as the wind was picking up once more. I hurriedly rammed the keys into the ignition, and I gunned the engine and thrown the car into gear, pulling around and quickly peeling out onto the road. I sped back towards the city. It wasn't until I hit the main highway before my heart stopped pounding and my breathing slowed to a normal level. A few hours later, less time than it took for me to drive out there, I was not doing the speed limit. I was home, with my doors locked and the sunlight streaming in through the windows. My phone turned on after I plugged it in. Now you work. So I messaged my sister so she wouldn't call the search and rescue. A day or so later, I called the Park Service and told them that I'd been stalked by some mountain lions on the trail, and they removed the area from the information section of their website. Nobody really went there anyway, they said. I didn't mention the abandoned car or the bloody boot, and I didn't tell anyone what really happened. After all, I mean, who would believe me of what I said anyway? There was no point in sending anyone else into the danger. Later, I started reading up on some local folklore and stopped pretty quickly. I came across something that made me start to shake at the description of it. I'm fairly sure I know now what that thing was, but I decided that I wouldn't look any more into it, and I'd just try to put it all out of my head. It hasn't really worked. I mean, my breath still catches in my throat every time I go into a dark room while I fumble around for a light switch. And I don't hike anymore. If I do go hiking, then it's strictly along well-used trails, and I never, ever do an overnighter. I had my work transfer me to a branch a long, long way away from the desert. I couldn't deal with feeling a hot wind anymore. I'm somewhere where it snows now. My encounter left me with a lot of unanswered questions, but one question ranks above all the rest, and it's something I'm not really sure I want to know the answer to. If that thing that I read about is real, well, then what else is real and hiding out there in the dark?